He wasn't born with a guitar in his hands. He was born with cotton under his fingernails. The year was 1932, and the town was Kingsland, Arkansas. John R. Cash. His name was a compromise of sorts. His mother insisted on John, his father on Ray. The result was something caught between dreams and reality. Much like the life of the boy himself, raised in poverty with 6 siblings and never enough bread to go around. In 1935, the Cash family clung to a lifeline, a government program introduced by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They moved to a place called Dyess, a farming colony in the Mississippi Delta, and began working the land. It was hard, dry soil that swallowed more than just seeds. It swallowed dreams, too. Everyone worked, children and adults alike, pulling weeds, picking cotton, sweating through the long days. But in the spaces between the labor, they sang. They sang like it could save them. For Johnny, no one was closer than his brother Jack. Kind, gentle, and dreaming of becoming a preacher. Then came a day that felt torn from a nightmare. Jack had taken a job at a sawmill working a circular saw. There was an accident. The blade tore through him. He lingered in pain for a week before he died. That was Johnny's first real heartbreak. The world tilted on its axis. The loss never truly left him. It followed him like a shadow, curling into bed beside him at night, waking with him in the morning. He didn't know how to cope with grief. Not yet, but deep inside, something began to stir. Something that would become his voice. Music. He started with gospel songs. His soul, reaching for the light, found it in chords and melodies. His mother and her friend taught him to play guitar, and he began writing not just tunes but confessions. At 12, his lyrics already held something more than childhood imagination. They were a kind of truth-telling he couldn't yet speak aloud. In the 1950s, when the U.S. was drawn into the Korean War, Johnny enlisted in the Air Force and was stationed in West Germany. Before he shipped out, he met Vivian Liberto at a skating rink. Laughter, spinning wheels, a teenage spark. Their love began light and simple, but over time grew deeper. When he came home, they married. The story of Johnny Cash isn't just about the rise from poverty to fame. It's about a journey paved with pain, music, faith, and the relentless search for self. A boy whose heart was broken early on, who spent a lifetime learning how to live in a way that let his songs piece other people back together. He was young, newly married, and, let's be honest, utterly lost about what to do with his life. It was as if he stood at a deserted crossroads. He already had a family, but no clear road lay ahead. Together with his wife, he relocated to Memphis, Tennessee, where he took a job selling household appliances. It was honest work, earned a few dollars, but left no mark on his soul. In the evenings, he picked up his guitar and chased musical dreams, playing in local joints alongside fellow dreamers, testing his mettle on the makeshift stage. Then one day, mustering all his courage, he knocked on the door of the legendary Sun Record studio. That first audition was more confession than performance. He sang gospel, pure and heavenly tunes. But Sam Phillips, the studio's founder, was a man of earth and grit, and his verdict cut sharp. Come back when you've tasted sin. Johnny left with his head down, but within him burned a stubborn spark. He did return, transformed. His songs now pulsed with the blood's own tremor. Restlessness, fire, rebellion. In 1955, Sun released his first 2 singles, Hey Porter and Cry, 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 and they were modest hits. While others washed away the dust of the day, Cash found his second home in the studio. His face grew familiar within those walls, and his name rippled through the music world. Then came 1956. During one session, Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis were in the booth alongside him when Elvis Presley himself dropped by. For future Titans, Cash, Perkins, Lewis, and Presley began to sing together. That moment, forever captured on a tape that lay forgotten for years and later surfaced as the $1 Million Quartet, marked history turning its head. But Johnny Cash was far from a million-dollar man. He still stood on the brink, almost among the stars, but not yet ablaze. Finally came the breakthrough, "I Walk the Line," a simple melody charged with the tension that squeezes the heart, a vow to remain faithful, to be worthy of love, to never stray. It stormed both the country and pop charts, and for a moment it seemed everything would smooth out. But life rarely follows a straight line. Johnny sang of fidelity even as his own heart beat in time with another voice, that of singer June Carter. Their bond went beyond passion. It was the collision of two forces. A mutual friend, Elvis Presley, as June joked, often made her listen to Johnny's songs in roadside cafes, dropping coins into jukeboxes. And Johnny had fallen for her voice long before they ever met. He'd been in love with it over the radio. Thus began not only a love story but a struggle with himself, with temptation, with fame, with the darkness inside. And at the center of it all was a man, no legend, no icon, but a living, conflicted seeker named Johnny Cash. They met in 1956, backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. But this wasn't just a casual encounter. It felt more like destiny finally catching up with itself. Two lives that had been moving toward each other for years, through music, through stages, through the chaos of the road. June Carter felt something strange that night, a kind of soul recognition, as if she had known Johnny Cash her whole life. And Johnny looked at her like he was seeing someone who understood him without needing to say a word. There was a spark, quiet but undeniable. Yet both of them were spoken for. And so, as painful as it was, they stepped back. They left their feelings backstage, handing them over to time, to hope, and maybe to some distant future. But when June finally divorced years later, she didn't go running into Johnny's arms. Instead, she married someone else. What Cash felt during that time, history doesn't fully record. But his silence may have said more than words ever could. He didn't speak, but he kept living like rules didn't apply to him. Rumors followed Johnny Cash everywhere, backstage, in hotel rooms, on long train rides between shows. His wife, Vivian Liberto, stayed home, raising their daughters, likely praying for the man she loved to come back changed. But on tour, Cash was someone else. Unbound, restless, often surrounded by women. And perhaps the hardest truth of all was that even while he flirted with June, he was secretly involved with her sister Anita. It was as if he was daring fate to catch up with him, as if he didn't believe that one day he'd have to pay for it all. By 1958, the Cash family had moved to Southern California. Their daughter Roseanne was born there. But as Johnny's fame grew, so did the emptiness inside him. He reached more and more for the bottle, later for pills. Eventually, he moved to Nashville, living with Waylon Jennings. They were like two engines that couldn't stop running. Amphetamines helped them stay awake during the endless tours, but the cost was steep. Cash became edgy, volatile, like his soul was being pulled apart. And it was during this storm of chaos that Ring of Fire was born. Not just a hit, but a confession. The song burned with passion, pain, and a kind of doomed inevitability. According to one version of the story, it was written by June Carter. The same June who, by then, seemed to be standing right in the center of that burning ring, watching love and destruction twist together into something inseparable. Or maybe the song was about her, not written with a pen, but carved out of the heart. Cash would sometimes say he came home one day and told Vivian, "I've got a song." But who it truly belonged to and what part of it was real was something only the two of them knew. Or maybe three, or maybe the whole country, listening to that deep, ragged voice, feeling the hurt hidden between the chords. The voice of a man whose life became legend, and whose love was a fire he walked into with his eyes wide open. He sat quietly by the riverbank, a fishing rod in his hand, the breeze rippling the water's edge, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a song was starting to take shape. That's how Ring of Fire was born. Johnny Cash wasn't alone. His friend Merle Kilgore was right there with him. And even then, it seemed like both of them could feel that this line, this fire, held something deeper than just metaphor. Later, Johnny decided that the song's credit should be shared with June Carter. Not out of chivalry, he once admitted it was simply because June needed the money. But June's name was coming up more and more often, and that began to get under the skin of Vivian Liberto, Cash's first wife. Vivian wasn't angry at the song itself. She was angry at what it implied. June had claimed that the phrase "ring of fire" came from old Elizabethan poetry. Vivian just scoffed. Poetry? No, she was convinced. This song throbbed with raw desire, too vivid and too intimate to be literary. And the story behind the song only grew stranger with time. Years later, Kilgore, looking back at its massive success, came up with a new way to cash in. His idea? Licensed Ring of Fire for a hemorrhoid cream commercial. Yes, really. A legendary song, reduced to a punchline. Thankfully, the Carter family flatly refused. Meanwhile, Johnny himself was burning in a much more literal way. In the summer of 1965, he went camping with his nephew Damon. Under the stars, in the woods, surrounded by silence. But somewhere between the crackling campfire and the flickers of his own inner demons, disaster struck. The camper caught fire. Flames spread through the dry brush, and soon, a vast stretch of land was ablaze. Hundreds of acres of Los Padres National Forest, a protected California wilderness, were scorched. Johnny called it an accident, just a spark from the camper. But his nephew told a different story. Said his uncle was high on pills, cold and confused, trying to light a fire, and never noticed when it turned into a monster. The government took him to court. Cash ended up paying nearly $900,000 in damages. But it wasn't just about the money. The fire had devastated a fragile ecosystem, even driving away the endangered California condors, one of the rarest birds on Earth. When Johnny was told about the damage, his response was as blunt as it was shocking. "I don't give a damn about your damn birds." That was the fire of Johnny Cash. Sometimes it sang, sometimes it warmed, and sometimes it burned everything to the ground. He walked through life as if to defy everyone. Stubbornly, with a challenge, and with some strange, painful desire to be the bad guy. Johnny Cash, a name that resonated not just from the stage, but also through police radios, newspaper headlines, and whispers. His reputation of being bold, dangerous, and lost seemed to fuel his very soul. He didn't seek approval. He sought freedom. Or perhaps he simply wanted to prove that he deserved the pain he carried inside. Once, in a fit of inexplicable impulse, Cash wreaked havoc on the nests of predatory birds. Yes, actual vultures, and this sparked an outcry from nature lovers. He just smirked. Society would protect birds, but never the broken souls. By that time, his life was already spiraling downward. His next stop, prison. Not as a convict, but as a performer. It might seem like a strange decision to give concerts among people chained up for murder and robbery. But in those prisons, San Quentin, Folsom, he sang as though it was home. As though his songs were not just music, but his last attempt to save something. Life magazine journalist Al Aronowitz once remarked, "Cash sang as though he was born among the very people he sang about." The truth, however, was different. He never truly lived behind bars. No long sentences or solitary confinement. His rebellious image was more myth than fact. Yes, he got into trouble, there's no denying that, but it always ended with nothing more than a night in a cell. One incident almost seemed comical. He was arrested for trespassing. Sounds ominous, doesn't it? In reality, he was just picking flowers. Yes, a huge man in black, with a face like a scorched field, reaching for wild buds. Another time, in El Paso, authorities were convinced he was a drug smuggler bringing narcotics across the border from Mexico. They arrested him and took him to the station. But instead of heroin or opiates, they found only prescription amphetamines. He was released formally with a reprimand and perhaps some internal relief. But the most painful part of this incident wasn't the arrest. Newspapers published photos of Johnny and his wife, Vivian. She was a beautiful, dark-skinned woman with Sicilian and African-American roots. And that's when their lives were invaded by not just journalists, but hatred. White racists saw their marriage as a challenge to their beliefs, and they reacted predictably. Threats, letters, shadows at the door. Johnny and Vivian became targets for daring to be together. It was as if danger was drawn to him, like a magnet to steel needles. Even behind the wheel, the car beneath him turned into an uncontrollable force. In 1967, he crashed and ended up behind bars again, for just one night as always. And once again, headlines, rumors, myths. Thus, the legend of Johnny Cash was born and solidified. The legend of the man who sang for prisoners, for the broken, for those who once stumbled. He was their voice, but he himself was just a man, wounded, weary, and desperately trying to understand. Who was he really? A hero in someone else's story or a prisoner of his own myths? His life was filled with more pain than he could bear. A pain hidden behind the bright mask of success, each line of which was shadowed by quiet, barely noticeable, yet still destructive addictions. When prescription drugs were found in his car, it wasn't just another crime. It was the moment his life began to fracture. The sheriff's gaze, when he offered him money and then refused, instead taking him to the station, was so intense that Johnny felt his soul tremble. Those words, stern but fair, were the final blow that ultimately made him reflect on his future. He was ready to change his life, but for that, he needed something to push him to take the first step. And that something was love. Not just any love, but a love that came with a challenge and a test. Johnny was at a breaking point. His family had fallen apart, and all he could think about was whether to continue or disappear. But in his heart, a new hope began to grow, and that hope came in the form of June Carter, a woman who set conditions before she could be with him. She couldn't be with him until he faced his addiction. This became his new challenge, his new goal. He invited her to live in his house, hoping it would help him fight his pain. Strangely enough, it was this love that began to change him. He became a man willing to fight for his life. And so, in London, standing on stage under the spotlight, he suddenly realized he couldn't live without her. He dropped to one knee and asked for her hand in marriage. She said yes. Their wedding took place a week later in Kentucky, and it seemed like everything would finally fall into place. But addiction, like a shadowy ghost, continued to haunt him. In those years, Johnny fell again. All he knew was how to be on the edge, how to fall, and how to get back up. When his son, little John Carter Cash, was born, he felt like this might be the moment he could defeat his addiction. But things weren't that simple. The shadow of his past caught up with him once more. His secret affair with June's sister, Anita, continued. And it was at the moment when June was expecting their first child that he found himself back in Anita's arms. But as difficult as it was, this inner struggle became part of his journey. His challenge wasn't just to overcome addiction, but to become a man worthy of love and of being loved. He wasn't ready yet. A few years later, in 1977, he became a slave to drugs again, and this time it was too much. He ended up at the Betty Ford Clinic, and it was his last chance to break free from the demons. He fought against himself with varying degrees of success. In 1989, despite all his efforts, he fell back into that cycle. The addiction returned. But it didn't stop him. On the contrary, all this was happening at a time when America, despite his internal battles, was preparing to welcome him into their homes. 1969 marked a turning point for Johnny. He became the face of a show on ABC, and for a time, it was more than just a comeback. It was a recognition that even when you're on the edge, you can still find your way. When Johnny Cash agreed to host his own TV show, he was promised full creative freedom. But this came at a price. ABC insisted on featuring Hollywood celebrities on the show, celebrities whose views often didn't align with Cash's own. He couldn't say no to Bob Hope or Peggy Lee, but when it came to censorship, Johnny was ready to fight. The moment came when Chris Christopherson, a talented songwriter, performed Sunday Morning Coming Down. In the lyrics, there was one word that sent shockwaves through the producers: stoned. For television, it was deemed unacceptable, and they demanded that Johnny ask Christopherson to change it. But Cash, ever stubborn and resolute, refused to comply. He stood his ground, and the word remained. Yet, despite his strong-willed nature, Cash was facing his own personal struggles. His daughter, Roseanne, had long felt resentment towards the years when her father was on the road, leaving her alone with an empty house. But in the later years of his life, their relationship began to change. Fate gave Roseanne a chance to reconnect with her father, though they didn't know how much time they had left together. On September 12, 2003, Johnny Cash passed away due to complications from diabetes, just 4 months after the death of his beloved wife, June Carter. And over the years, strange and little-known details from his life began to surface. In the late 1950s, Cash took an unexpected step. He openly spoke out in defense of Native American rights, a stance that was far from popular in the country music world at the time. Back then, fans of the genre were more interested in cowboy stories than in the struggles of indigenous peoples. But Johnny wasn't afraid to go against the grain. It was his choice, his personal battle, one that didn't always resonate with his fans. Yet he couldn't stand idly by when it came to issues of justice. In a world where stories often hide behind solemn faces and faceless dates, there is always room for remarkable revelations and unexpected discoveries. Johnny Cash's story is not just a musical legend, but also a tale of searching for one's roots, of how sometimes the person who feels connected to something turns out to be far less connected than they thought. For a long time, Cash believed that Cherokee blood ran through his veins. The pride and weight of these roots supported him throughout his life. This deep sense of connection with the Native American people, almost like something that could explain his internal struggles, his poetry, and music, became an essential part of his very being. However, years later, when his daughter, Roseanne Cash, decided to trace her father's footsteps and uncover the truth about her heritage, the reality turned out to be much more complex. On the show Finding Your Roots, she discovered that she had no ancestral ties to Native American tribes. Instead, it turned out that her ancient ancestors, like her father's, had African roots. Not that this made it any less significant. It actually reminded us that the search for one's roots can be as multifaceted and unexpected as life itself. Nevertheless, even though we can no longer remember Cash as a proud descendant of the Cherokee, one small town in Mississippi found its own way to remember him. This town, Starkville, witnessed what seemed like the most absurd and amusing event. Johnny Cash was arrested for picking a few flowers. It was a story full of absurdity, but it too became part of the legend, leaving behind no trace of malice, just sincere human naivety. And so, in 2007, many years later, Starkville decided to mark the occasion and somehow make amends, organizing a festival in Johnny Cash's honor and celebrating his floral misdeed. In November of that year, the town wanted not only to forgive him for his minor infraction, but also to celebrate his life and work, lifting him out of the shadows of misconceptions. Thus, the world gradually intertwines with the life of a celebrity, creating myths and images that stay in the hearts of people. But, as with Johnny himself, it's important to remember that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found. Whether in flowers, a burst of freedom, or a tender, contradictory soul.